No one would have believed a nation could be convinced that advancing alien tripods from Mars were at their doorstep, and yet Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast has earned a place in infamy for supposedly doing just that. Regardless of the actual extent of the panic, whether there were mobs in the street and citizens fleeing their homes in terror, it's evident simply by the legend of it that it was an effective dramatisation of H.G. Wells' iconic tale. One which not just Orson Welles, but all of the cast and crew clearly calculated and crafted with such a command of their audience. So how did they manage to accomplish such a reaction from merely an audio story? I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening, Orson later explained, and would be broadcast in such a dramatised form as to appear to be a real event taking place at that time, rather than a mere radio play. He had been inspired by a radio production on the BBC over a decade earlier, broadcast in the Barricades by Reverend Ronald Knox, that simulated a live report of revolution in London, people murdered by crowds and the Houses of Parliament destroyed in the chaos. Only a few months later, the General Strike of 1926 happened, an event that brought Britain to a halt, with the worry of an actual revolution being ever so close. From this, it's clear that Knox's broadcast had encapsulated the feeling and fears of the public at that time, and 12 years later, the War of the Worlds would likewise capitalise on the alarming air of anxiety the audience had in anticipation of what would become the Second World War. For the Halloween episode of Orson's The Mercury Theatre on the Air series aired on CBS Radio that presented performances of classic literary works, there was a desire to strike a bit of light-hearted fear into the listeners, and as a result, Wells discussed his fake newscast idea with producer John Houseman. It was decided to adapt a work of science fiction, with various stories considered before they purchased the radio rights to the War of the Worlds, a story that Houseman later suspected Wells had never read. They assigned their writer Howard Koch to turn this novel into a script for their show, an intimidating task he was given less than a week to do. Only a day into the process, he telephoned Houseman deeply distressed, claiming he could not make The War of the Worlds as a radio play interesting or credible. With only 36 hours before rehearsals were to begin, Houseman joined Koch and his assistant on working through the night before managing to get the first draft finished on schedule. A demo recording of the script was created for Wells, who was immersed in rehearsing a Mercury stage production of Danton's Death scheduled to open the following week. After hearing it, he concluded that it was indeed dull, and he advised the writers to add more news flashes and eyewitness accounts to create a stronger sense of urgency and excitement. They did just that, and what resulted on the 30th of October 1938 is considered by many to be one of the greatest hoaxes in history. The Mercury Theatre on the Air's presentation of The War of the Worlds begins with a statement explaining the production, before the announcer introduces Orson Welles, who naturally delves into a paraphrase of the opening of the novel, updated to contemporary times. One of the things that's quite interesting about this one, however, is the way it takes further effort to first construct in the listeners' minds the actual reality that they're living in. In the book, after the line, "Early in the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment," H.G. Wells then writes extensively about the planet Mars and the scientific nature of the possibility of life on that planet. Howard Koch's script, however, instead writes about Earth.
In the 39th year of the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment. It was near the end of October. Business was better. The war scare was over. More men were back at work. Sales were picking up. On this particular evening, October 30th, Crosley Service estimated that 32 million people were listening in on radios.
I guess it's sort of similar to what they did with the opening scene of The Last of Us TV series, where the prologue of the first episode grounds the show in the reality that the audience has lived in, by comparing the disaster that's about to happen in the show with real-world examples that the audience has lived or is living through. The War of the Worlds is perhaps almost prophetic in depicting a devastating invasion in 1939, at a height of American paranoia around the ever-growing Germany, which had only just yet again further increased its territory thanks to the Munich Agreement. It was hoped that due to this treaty that was signed exactly a month prior to the broadcast, conflict had been averted, and the transmission cleverly takes advantage of this by mentioning that the war scare was over, as well as pointing out how business and life was improving, finally beginning to recover from the Great Depression. Firstly, it's like reminding the listeners of the previously likely unthinkable yet devastating events that had and were occurring within the previous decade, which puts them in frame of mind of being able to comprehend this kind of occurrence happening. But also, it says, but everything's safe now. Everything's getting better, the war scare has ended, the bad times are nearly over. So it creates a safe environment that then puts the audience further on the edge and enhances the horror when it inevitably gets shattered in this story. It's like, well, you may feel like you're safe right now, but even so, you know full well such sudden catastrophe can happen to you, because similar events have happened to them. Even by specifying it to be the exact same date as the broadcast, furthers the connection the audience feels and heightens the urgency of it, even though it's a year into the future. Another method used to ground it in reality was introduced when the script was reworked at Orson's request, now including the names of real places and people whenever possible. This was done to such a degree that it actually had to be revised yet again after it was sent to the network's legal department, who were concerned it was too credible to the point of risking lawsuits against them. As a result, the writers reluctantly made around 28 slight changes to names. For example, mentions of the real Trans-America Radio News was changed to Intercontinental Radio News. The Columbia Broadcasting Building was shortened to simply Broadcasting Building. The New Jersey National Guard replaced with the State Militia, and New York's St. Patrick's Cathedral now only referred to as the Cathedral. Different enough to avoid legal action, but close yet vague enough that it still aligns with the listener's reality and brings them into this world. After the opening narration, the infamous simulation of a normal event radio broadcast begins, featuring a weather report and live music by an orchestra. After a few minutes, the music is interrupted by several news flashes about strange gas explosions on Mars. An interview is arranged with reporter Carl Phillips and Princeton-based astronomy professor Richard Pearson, played by Orson Welles, who dismisses speculation about life on Mars. The musical program returns temporarily, but is interrupted again by news of a strange meteorite landing in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. It was a very clever decision to have the event take place here, as this isn't just setting it in the contemporary United States. This is setting it in American equivalences to the original English tale. Grover's Mill, much like Horsell Common, is a real place that's relatively rural, yet both are close to the biggest city in their respective countries, just as London is within a concerning distance of the Martians. New York City is similarly under threat. Not only that, but Grover's Mill is also near Princeton University, which continues the thread of the story so far by now having reporter Phillips and Professor Pearson sent to the landing site, where a large crowd has gathered around the unscrewing capsule. After it opens, the news report describes the tentacled, horrific Martians that emerge. Police officers approach them waving a flag of truce, but are met with incineration from their heat ray. igniting the nearby woods and cars as the crowd screams. To create the role of reporter Carl Phillips, the actor Frank Readick went to the record library and repeatedly played the recording of the dramatic radio report of the Hindenburg disaster by Herbert Morrison that happened just the year before. Embodying this, reporter Phillips shouts about the incoming flames.
There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. The whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles, spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
He's cut off mid-sentence, and after a moment of dead air, an announcer explains that the remote broadcast was interrupted due to some difficulty with the field transmission, after which there's a brief piano interlude. The music of this production is said to have been vital to its success, with some citing it as being the reason it was so effective. It was performed by Bernard Herrmann and his orchestra, but the really expert part about it is the way in which the music was used. Wells wanted the music to play for unbearably long stretches of time, with the emergency fill-in music being a solo piano playing Debussy and Chopin. Producer Houseman later wrote, "As it played on, its effect became increasingly sinister. A thin band of suspense stretched almost beyond endurance. That piano was the neatest trick of the show." After this, and I'm skipping over quite a bit throughout all of this by the way, the state militia are deployed to the area and the entire region is placed under martial law, with residents ordered to evacuate. The Red Cross has dispatched emergency workers to the scene, and it's reported that reporter Carl Phillips is among the dead. Due to the ongoing emergency, the radio station turns its facilities over to the militia, which leads to one of my favourite parts, where we then hear from Captain Lansing of the Signal Corps, attached to the militia now engaged in military operations in the vicinity of Grover's Mill. He lectures about the overwhelming force of his battalions of infantry that now surround the supposed helpless Martians hiding in their pit, lit up by the army's searchlights. He boasts, "These creatures can scarcely stand up against heavy machine gun fire. Anyway, it's an interesting outing for the troops. I can make out their khaki uniforms crossing back and forth in front of the lights. It looks almost like a real war." He's very nonchalant about it until he notices the first of the tripods rising from the pit, incinerating the militia in what is reported on the news as one of the most startling defeats ever suffered by any army in modern times. Considering it takes place in 1939, this is essentially the World War II, the War of the Worlds. We've had a lot of different adaptations of the story taking place at various different times, but this is the World War II version, and it really feels like it, understandably considering it was done in that era, as the radio describes the battles that take place. The tripod's movements are monitored, and the march by this vanguard of an invading army from Mars is broadcast to every home in America. There's a statement from Washington, read by, meant to be President Roosevelt, but for legal reasons, the Secretary of the Interior, who attempts to reassure the panicked nation and urge them to remain rational, so that we may confront this destructive adversary with a nation united, courageous, and consecrated to the preservation of human supremacy on this earth. After which it is reported that more explosions have been observed on Mars, indicating that more war machines are on their way. Furious battles take place between this Martian menace and the US military. American artillery units are easily dealt with, succumbing to the poisonous black smoke now being ejected from the tripods. A wing of US Air Force bombers is sent to strike them down, yet are slain by their heat rays. The lead plane manages to take one out in a last-ditch effort by crashing into it, but generally the attacks are futile. The black smoke spreads over the Jersey marshes into Newark. and eventually a news reporter transmitting from atop the broadcasting building describes live the Martian invasion of New York City and the encroachment of the poison. People attempting to save themselves by diving into the East River, while others in Times Square are said to be falling like flies. He reads a final bulletin stating that Martian cylinders have fallen all over the country, then describes the smoke approaching his location until he coughs and apparently collapses, leaving only the sounds of the panicked city in the background. Eventually, a radio operator is heard repeatedly asking,
Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone?
Before dropping silent. After nearly 10 seconds of silence, the announcer breaks in to remind the viewer that they're listening to a CBS presentation of Orson Welles in the Mercury Theatre on the air, in an original dramatization of The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. And there's a brief intermission for the middle break of the programme. This is 40 minutes into it, and you might think it seems quite unusual to not have the middle break of an hour-long programme, in the middle, the halfway point, and indeed, the break was delayed 10 minutes to accommodate the dramatic content, which further enhanced the realism of the performance by having this faux rolling news uninterrupted, heightening the urgency. However, it is seldom mentioned that the entire programme was not done in this style, and it's at this point that the format switches to a more conventional radio play. The final 16 minutes or so focus on Orson Welles' Professor Pearson, who is discovered to have survived the initial attack and has been hiding for days in a house at Grover's Mill. He monologues his thoughts, having become obsessed with the idea that he may be the last living man on Earth, and eventually leaves, wandering about the Martian-occupied landscape, attempting to make contact with other humans. After days, he encounters nothing but a red squirrel, whom he says
stares back at me. I believe at that moment the animal and I shared the same emotion, the joy of finding another living being.
He continues onwards, trailing the tripods out of sight, proclaiming this somehow feels safer than running away from them. Another day passes and he comes across a paranoid artilleryman who's gone insane and holds the belief that the only option is waiting and learning in this new world, with the goal of eventually using the tripods against the Martians themselves. Here, however, he expresses his desire to also use them against humans as well, annihilating the weak and having mastery over both races and the entire planet.
Imagine having one of them lovely things with its heat ray wide and free. We'd turn it on Martians, we'd turn it on men. We'd bring everybody down on their knees.
That's your plan.
At this, Pearson swiftly departs, proclaiming he wants no part of the artilleryman's world.
Bye, stranger.
He continues onto the dead New York, where he discovers that the Martians have died due to the earthly pathogenic germs to which they had no immunity. Life returns to normal, and Pearson finishes writing his recollections of the invasion and its aftermath. I think what's most impressive about this story is the way the writers managed to take The War of the Worlds, a book that, judging by audio readings, is over 6.5 hours worth of content, and in only a couple of days managed to compact that down into less than an hour, yet still hits most of the points. As the producer Houseman wrote, our actual broadcasting time from the first mention of the meteorites to the fall of New York City was less than 40 minutes. During that time, men travelled long distances, large bodies of troops were mobilised, cabinet meetings were held, savage battles fought on land and in the air, and millions of people accepted it, emotionally if not logically. Indeed, it's impressive that in such a short span of time, they managed to not only adapt this story, but revise it in a new form of media that really tapped into the audience's minds in such a realistic, yet exciting way. The Mercury Theatre and everyone involved in this production truly combined the art of writing, performances, music and sound effects to tell this story in such a unique yet blatantly very effective way. One that's been embedded in the American mind since. It's interesting when reading modern day American articles, not about this version, but just about the War of the Worlds in general. I've noticed that they often seem to start off by mentioning this broadcast, like this one here for example. Most of us know the War of the Worlds because of Orson Welles' slightly too realistic radio adaptation, first broadcast on Halloween 1938. Like, it's almost the first point of reference to the American general public, seemingly, from what I gather, and in the book itself is arguably an afterthought, apparently. The fact that even in this age, where we've since had the George Powell and Steven Spielberg films, the Orson Welles transmission is still, judging from this, the first point of reference for the War of the Worlds used to identify it to Americans, shows how iconic it truly is. The transmission ends with a closing statement by Orson Welles, this time out of character to reassure the audience that the broadcast has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be.
Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates by tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. If your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian. It's Halloween.